what does it take to become a prolific author, especially one that is writing fiction? Because I've done nonfiction. I feel like I can do that in my sleep at this point, although I know I can always improve. But with fiction, it's a whole new realm for me. And if it's a new realm for you, then maybe this conversation's going to be something you're going to want to stop and listen to. And hey, maybe experienced folks can use a little bit of a rehash, or maybe you might agree or disagree. This is what brings in a good friend of mine, Matty Dalrymple. She's actually the host of the Indie Author Podcast. I've made numerous appearances on her podcast before, so I thought I'd bring her on in over here and talk to her about writing prolifically. How is it that she's able to put out so much content at such a high quality? And that's what I'm always thinking about, and especially now that I'm venturing into the world of fiction writing. So without any further ado, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, Matty Dalrymple.
You know, we might as well just go ahead and say that right now. You are guest number 26. How crazy is that? It's a long time in the making, though, because you actually did appear on the podcast channel previously, right?
I believe so. You have so many channels, I forget what I've been on and what I haven't been on, but I believe I have.
But I know I've been over to the Indie Author Podcast countless times. So what took me so long to get you over here?
I know. What are you up to? You're like on number 5 or 6 or something like that on the Indie Author Podcast. I have some catching up to do.
Yeah, it's quite a bit. It's been really fun. But as you kind of know, you and I were talking before we got connected here about the fact that I took a pivot into fiction. And part of that is I'm going into the world of horror writing. And I love to not just go into gruesome, gory type details. I love to build that suspense. And so to me, with you having such a successful background in suspense and thriller writing, I thought we could kind of tap into something like that, if that's cool with you.
Yeah, that'd be a fun conversation.
So I want to start out the very first thing here is this. What's the secret to writing and publishing so much? I wouldn't open up your Amazon Author Central page and good Lord, you've got a lot of books.
Well, some of the key to that is that some of those are short stories. So I have, I think, currently 6 standalone short stories in the Ann Kinnear world that are out there. And then I have 3 thriller novels, Lizzie Ballard thrillers, and I have 4 and soon to be 5 Ann Kinnear suspense novels. And so that's, been accumulating over a long time. The first novel came out in 2013. So part of the trick is just to do it for a long time. But yeah, I'm on a once a year, sometimes twice a year schedule for the novels.
Okay. So it's just consistently putting out content is kind of your secret then. Yeah. Nice. So you started where everybody else starts, at a big old fat goose egg, no books at all, and you just continue to just kind of chip away at it. Yeah. Was there any year that you ever produced more books or more publications over another one?
Well, when I still had a day job, I was on more of a every other year schedule. And then in 2019, I left my corporate job and I was able to get into I had a goal for a little while of 2 novels a year. That turned out to be overenthusiastic because, and maybe we'll talk about this, the plots of my fiction books are quite complex. And so I realized that trying to manage the complexity along with all the other things you have to put into a book was too much. So now I'm thinking more like every 9 months, every 12 months is realistic, along with other things I'm doing. I'd like to get more nonfiction works out, as you have been so prolific in doing. And then using the short fiction as kind of a filler in between.
Yeah. So when you started out, was Ann Kinnear like your flagship brand? Is that where you started?
Yeah. Well, the first book that I wrote, which was the first Ann Kinnear book, The Sense of Death, as I'm sure is true of many, many other people, I didn't know that it was going to be a series. I thought it was going to be a standalone, or at least I thought it could well be a standalone. And then I was so sort of entranced with Ann's world and came up with other ideas that I wanted to explore. But yeah, Ann is definitely my flagship series. The Lizzie Ballard thriller trilogy is a trilogy, and I don't discount getting back to that at some point, but it would be quite different. So in the books, the Lizzie Ballard books as they stand now, they take her from being very young to a teenager. If I return to them, then she would probably be an adult and they would probably be somewhat different. But yeah, I'm focusing most of my fiction attention on Ann.
So what was that first book, like your first full-length novel, or did you go out as a short story in that specific instance?
No, I went out as a novelist, and it was only
Wow.
later. This was kind of a backwards thing, but I only really got into short fiction. Well, as a way to tide my readers over from one Anne book to the other, because after book two there was a lag because I got interested in Lizzie, and then that series turned into three. What I thought might be a standalone turned into a series of three, and so I started out
Whoops.
putting the short stories out, to keep the Anne fans happy.
Yeah, awesome. So it wasn't. It was just a means to an end. It was like, okay, hang on to this. I'll be back to you. But right now, I'm handling business with this thriller series.
Yep, exactly.
Do you anticipate that you're going to end up doing more of the short stories to build off the whole Anne Kinnear universe?
Yeah, well, my goal is to have 12. So I have six.
Okay.
And I'm trying to set one in each month of the year. And then when I have 12, I'm going to publish a collection called A Year of Kinnear with one story in each month. And I kind of feel required to write more short fiction because I co-authored the book Taking the Short Tack, which is about the business side of short fiction with Mark Leslie Lefebvre. And then my name started getting out there, being associated with short fiction. And so I'm going to be, Mark and I were invited to the Ally Self PubCon last year to do one on the craft of short fiction. And we were both like, oh my God, the craft of short fiction. But we approached that as, speaking to our fellow short fiction authors, not, presenting ourselves as the big expert. But now my name has gotten out there related to short fiction. So I'm getting more requests for articles. I wrote an article for Writer's Digest about using short fiction. I'm going to be presenting at their conference this summer in New York on short fiction. And so I kind of feel like I better keep writing short fiction to hold up, this evolving reputation.
That's cool. All right, I want to shift over a little bit into the actual substance of what you're writing and such. How does your approach differ between, say, the suspense novel series versus the thriller series?
Well, I would say that the first Anne Kinnear book and the three Lizzie books are somewhat similar in that they're all thriller suspense, in the sense that the question that's driving them is, will the protagonist survive and will justice be done? And so in the first in the first Anne Kinnear book, it starts right out with a murder. It's not a whodunit. It's not a mystery. The reader sees who dies, although Anne does not know that. So it's more the suspense of Anne's walking unsuspectingly into this dangerous situation, and is she going to get out of it? And then, as I think you and I have talked about, the second Anne Kinnear book became more of a mystery. And that's when the complexities really started coming in, especially books 3 through 6, which were all true traditional whodunit mysteries. And then you're introducing those ideas of how much do you reveal to the reader at each step along the way? How much is too much? How much is too little? Because you're not giving the reader a chance to guess whodunit, which I think is what a lot of people are reading mysteries for. And so, the difference between Anne 2 through N and Lizzie and Anne 1 has been the biggest difference in the difference between suspense and mystery.
When you pivoted more towards, say, suspense mystery, did you at all lose any of your readership, or did you find that it opened you up to more avenues?
I don't know. It's very hard, I think, to assess that kind of thing, except anecdotally. So there are a lot of reviews I get. I have good reviews for all my books, enthusiastic readers, and many of them say, as a caution to other readers, the first book in the Anne series is not a whodunit. They explain what I just explained to you. And I haven't gotten any pushback, but I've sort of avoided wading through. In general, I avoid wading through my reviews in detail because I think that's just a rabbit hole that's difficult to go down. So I'm not sure, but I'm starting to explore whether there are audiences that I'm not reaching yet because they don't realize that a series called the Suspense series is actually a mystery series if they start on book 2. And I've talked a little bit with people about rebranding, but I think that what I'm going to do, I just started working with somebody to do Amazon ads. And one of the things that I talked about with him is there may be a different audience for books 2 and on. And so he's emphasizing the mystery aspect more with books 2 and then emphasizing more of the suspense aspect with book one. So I'll be curious to see if that approach and positioning makes a change.
Do you think that you would ever go back and rework the first book so that it does have that mystery element in it?
I don't think I could, because it would be a huge rework to do that. I can imagine, maybe depending on the results of this test that we're doing through Amazon Ads, maybe repositioning it more as a prequel or an origin story.
Ooh, smart.
And but I've really resisted the idea of actually rebranding the series The Ann Kinnear Mysteries, because I might get to book 7 and the idea I have isn't a mystery. It's back to suspense. And so I think it's easier to say suspense and let the mysteries come along than to say mystery, which I think is a more specific commitment to the reader and not provide a true mystery. So those are sort of the avenues I'm following at the moment.
I think that's smart, actually, when I'm thinking about this, because I mean, you have to think there's plenty of overlap between suspense and mystery, because mystery to a certain extent does thrive on that element of suspense. Like, what's going to happen? I don't understand what's going on. I'm really thrilled. Let's keep reading. So yeah, that's really cool. I could see, though, that you're in like that position where it's just like, do I rebrand it? I've got 12 books to go through, but here I am. I think you're probably right to trust your gut and maybe stick with suspense. Then you're not painted back into a corner going, why did I change it?
Yeah. And I do think that it's a question, I hear about people who are very sort of tactical, or maybe strategic, I should be saying, about the books they choose to write. They see an opportunity in the mystery genre, and so they write mystery. And my ideas just don't come that way. There's an idea that I'm very excited about, and I write it, and I'm not thinking. I would like to be able to think, what shelf is this going to go on in the bookstore? But I just, my creative mind doesn't work that way.
So you're definitely not the type of person that, to steal something from Chris Fox, what he usually says, which is writing to market.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm more accommodating the marketing after I've finished it than having in mind that there's a market I want to be writing to.
Yeah, I think there's been oftentimes some people probably misunderstand me when I say something like, writing to market's definitely a good idea. But I think also it's a good idea to not deny your muse.
Right.
I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would. I think that people could get themselves all caught up in all sorts of creative frustration if they focus too heavily on the market. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but if it's not how you create, then trying to force yourself into that is not a good idea. And I think that in the end, you shoot yourself in the foot, because if people are reading a book that the author didn't enjoy writing, I think they sense that, and it's going to come back to haunt you.
Gotcha. All right, I've got one that's going to be a deeper question, and please, ask questions back if you need me to kind of state this better. What are some of the critical elements to building tension? Because I am kind of like the guy that I love to get to like the action, and I like to get to like the reveal, but for some reason I feel impatient when it comes to building that tension.
Yeah, well, I think that one trick is to make sure that you end chapters or scenes on a cliffhanger, but not too much of a cliffhanger. Although I think for certain readers, that's okay. I think that for me, when I'm reading those kinds of books, I get frustrated if there are too many chapters that end with, she opened the door and her jaw dropped when she saw what was behind it. End of chapter. I'm like, oh, come on. So I think you want to lead the reader through to the next chapter, but not drive them crazy in the process of doing that. I think also I'm actually, because I'm thinking so deeply about this, I'm thinking more in terms of mystery than suspense, and those ideas of where do you drop the clues and where do you not drop the clues, which I think is part of suspense. There's some things that are very obviously a clue, but are maybe not completely clear what it's a clue to. There are the clues that are hiding in plain sight, but no one realizes they're a clue until the end. And I think that astute mystery readers notice those, and that's part of the suspense of leading them through. But I think that an obvious way of building tension in suspense is when the reader knows more than the protagonist does. And so in my first Anne book, the suspense is building because the reader knows Anne is walking into a dangerous situation, but Anne doesn't know that. And so there's a scene where she's a woman who can sense spirits, and she does this for hire. And the murderer actually hires her for a sensing engagement because he's curious as to whether she's the real deal. He's been poo-pooing her, and then he realizes that there's a detective on the Philadelphia police force who's actually paying attention to her. So he's starting to get nervous. And so, under an alias, he hires her for a job. And so she's sitting in a house alone with a murderer who could have good reason for wanting her out of there. And so that idea that the reader's going, run for your life, and Anne doesn't know that is, I think, another way you can build tension.
Oh, man. You just opened my brain up to a treasure trove of ideas, and my list of questions just now almost becomes, a little less, because I tell you, this is absolutely incredible. I love the cliffhanger idea, and you're saying that this is a device that we could use, but we shouldn't abuse it, right?
Right.
Gotcha. All right, so I want to kind of back up a little bit and have more of an overhead view of your approach. How do you develop your stories?
Well, my answer to this would be really different than it would have been a year ago. So what I was struggling with is I wrote, I always go in with some level of overview, I'll say. And I'll be intentional why, it'll be clear why I'm using that terminology in a moment. So I was thinking through the storyline for Anne Kinnear 5, and as with many of my stories, it was inspired by a very particular experience that I myself had had. And so that was at the center of it, and then I was trying to build around it into a story that would make sense. And so I wrote my 80,000 word first draft, and I stepped back and took a look at it, and I started seeing where it was not hanging together. I actually had an edit done. Normally, I only have one edit done on a book, but the editor came back and he saw even more places where it wasn't hanging together.
Oh, no.
And so that was a book that I intended to get out in 6 months. So last year, I had books that came out in April and October. Okay. No, I'm sorry. I had books that came out in October and April, and then this book was supposed to come out last October. And I kept pushing it. And because it was a mystery and it was very tightly intertwined, it was a fairly complex novel where the who knows what when was very important. Every time I tweaked one aspect of it, as I like to say, another plank fell off the boat. Because
it has a rippling effect.
It had a rippling effect. And then I would go back and fix that problem. And guess what? That would cause a whole other list of things. And so, it will end up being about a year. This one will take me about a year to get out, which was much longer than I had counted on. But it taught me the lesson that when I'm writing these very complex stories with plot intricacies that depend on each other, then it doesn't behoove me to jump into the detail until I have what I'm now calling the frame in place. So you know that in the Indie Author Podcast, I like nautical metaphors for the writing craft and the publishing voyage. So the metaphor I have in mind is the frame of a small boat. And the dialogue and the description are what I'm calling the bright work. So bright work is the terminology that's used in wooden boats, not only for the metal trim, but also for the very highly polished woodwork. And so this was a perfect metaphor to me, that I had been polishing the bright work before I had my frame in place. And so for Anne Kinnear 6, which is the book that I'm working on now, I wrote an overview. I wrote it all in chronological order, not the order that it would appear in the book, but years ago, Jane, the antagonist, got angry because of something. Just chronologically what happened, so I could check the logic. Wrote it all in present tense, used a different font to distinguish it in my mind from the actual manuscript that I would eventually write. And that was about 5,000 words. And when I got to the end of that 5,000 words, I saw where there was a plot hole. And it was a lot easier to fix it when I had 5,000 words than when I would have 80,000 words. I went through and fixed it.
Smart.
Continued beefing it up. After the second pass, it was like 10,000 words, then 15 and 20. And each time I was being able to add a little bit more detail, a little bit more bright work, but not but still have the flexibility to change things. So I think after Pass 2, I thought, you know what? The crime is really not gripping. I'm going to have it be both a different crime and a different bad guy. And you just hate having to do that if you've written 80,000 words based on bad guy number 1. It's a real deterrent to having it be bad guy number 2. But I was like, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm only going to have to change a couple hundred words if I want to do that. And so I really anticipate that every time I go through, it's going to become more and more beefed up until eventually I'll just be like, oh, now I'm writing the manuscript. Now I'm not framing anymore. Now I'm doing the bright work. And the reason that I call it framing and not outlining is that idea of true outlining, like Roman numeral 1, indent, capital A, like that feels very restrictive, whereas framing to me feels very foundational, and that's what I'm going for with this approach that I'm taking now.
It sounds like I'm doing almost a mixture of the outline, like the actual Roman numeral 1, those type of things. But I also go and do like the same thing that you're doing, to where I kind of, okay, I set the scene, I try to lay it out so that way I know what I'm talking about when I sit down and start cranking it out. Because then I go, oh yeah, that's right, I remember that little element. So that's really cool.
And I even put in the frame, I'll put, Dirk drove his classic car to the meeting with Anne, in parentheses. It was a clear day. It was a nice weather day. It wasn't raining. And I said, the reason it's not raining is that Dirk wouldn't take his classic car out if it were raining, which keeps me from thinking, oh, you know what would be really atmospheric if it was raining? And then 2,000 words later go, oh, I remember why it was sunny, because of Dirk's car. And so all those little notes to myself about, this is why you're doing this, don't forget later.
You're leaving those little breadcrumbs for yourself, and you're going, okay, this is what we need to do. All right, we're going to start to wrap up today's podcast, but I always like to really ask each one of the guests, what advice do you have for aspiring authors and self-publishers?
Well, I guess my advice would be maybe different for those two questions. I think that for aspiring writers, it would be decide whether you want to call yourself a writer or whether you actually want to write. I think that sometimes people like the idea of being a writer and don't necessarily like the process of writing. And I think if it's the first, you have a tough road ahead of you. But if you enjoy the process of writing, then you should be writing. And I'll just add, if you're writing at all, you get to call yourself a writer. I had a long conversation about this in a book club. A writer's group. Am I a writer? Well, yeah, if you're putting pencil to paper or fingers on keyboard, you're writing. That means you're a writer. Yeah. So that's the advice I would say about writing. And then if people want to independently publish, I would say my advice is that you're trading. It's been a while since I've given this spiel. I'm trying to shorten it up. Access and bragging rights, if you follow the traditional path, against creativity, control, care, and cash, if you're following the indie route. Meaning, if you choose the indie route, you're taking all the responsibility, but you get to make all the decisions, which some people like and some people don't. So again, consider those when you make your decision.